Right here on Public Exposure, as we investigate the mortgage foreclosure crisis, not everything that we're going to talk about relates to a single home loan. Instead, we're going to be talking about why banks aren't lending, the silent liquidity squeeze, and a lot more right here with Ellen Brown, author and attorney, but the author, Web of Debt. Right here on Public Exposure. Ellen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan.
We've got an awful lot to cover. So first off, though, Web of Debt. This is quite a book. It's quite a website, by the way, webofdebt.com. To be sure, we're going to get it up several times throughout. But tell us just a little bit about Web of Debt, why you wrote it.
I wrote it, actually it's my 11th book, and the last few books before that I had written on the alternative healthcare and the politics of healthcare, and then as a lawyer, I was representing some alternative healthcare practitioners, and one was this cancer therapist who wound up he was in Tijuana, and he was arrested for the alleged fraud of saying he had a cancer cure, or a high rate of cure for cancer, which I actually thought he did. But in the course of that, I realized that the pharmaceutical cartel and the banking cartel were the same thing. I mean, it all goes back to a Rockefeller cartel at the turn of the 20th century, and that where they got the power, their power was from the power to create money. And that if you wanted to solve the whole problem, that's where you should direct your energy. So that was just so interesting. And then when I discovered that The Wizard of Oz was actually written as a monetary allegory, that was my hook. You know, it gave me a storyline, and so
there we go. By the way, if you want to learn something about the world of finance, go to the blog, and you can get there from webofdebt.com, but go to the blog because there is so much there. But right now I wanted to ask this about the silent liquidity squeeze and why banks aren't lending. Is this a jobs issue? And I've got to go to this. This is from the Fiscal Times about what can the Fed do. And here's this. Economists are divided on why banks are not lending, but increasingly are focusing on a Fed policy of paying interest on reserves, a policy that began, interestingly enough, on October the 9th, 2008, and almost exactly the moment when the financial crisis became acute. The Fed is paying interest to banks to keep money?
That's right. So there are now 1.6 trillion in excess reserves sitting on the books of the banks, which they are not lending. So that's 10 times what they actually, or more than 10 times what they actually need in terms of reserves. And the reason they're keeping them on their books is that the Fed is paying them just as much as they would get at the Fed funds rate from other banks, and so they have no motivation to lend them to the other banks. But that's where the local banks get their money to lend to local businesses. And it's all the excess reserves are sitting on the Wall Street banks. These are the banks that get the money from the Fed originally, because there's 20 banks that are the bond dealers.
People who are into political blaming would say, okay, October 9th, 2008, we know who was president then. Was this a backroom deal coming from that particular president and that particular administration to protect some cronies through the Fed?
I doubt it. I actually think it's a misconception on the part of the Fed that the Fed is attempting to keep control of the money supply. They couldn't do it, and they lost every other form of control. And the one thing they're hanging on to is the Fed funds rate. And so their thought was, if they were pumping all this extra money in the form of quantitative easing into the economy, that would inflate the economy, and that there would be so much money out there that the banks would be borrowing from each other at virtually zero. In other words, the Fed funds rate would drop even lower than 0.25%.
That's
and
if
so
money,
they're setting a ceiling on it.
And that's if money is a product. And people don't think of money as a product, do they?
That's another misconception. Money today is not backed by anything. It's not backed by gold. It is really a series of legal agreements. So it's really, it's really a legal issue.
Let's go to this TARP, excess bank reserves. Let's go to it, the chart. Here we've got, basically from 1960, 1970, 80, 90, 2000, there was zero excess bank reserves. This is not zero reserves, but excess. But now you look in 2010, at a time when the public needs so much money, you can't get there.
Right. And the argument is they have all these excess reserves, and so businesses can't get money because they don't qualify for loans, but that's not true. There are many businesses. I'm from California, and I know that the California local businesses, their biggest complaint is that they cannot get credit like they used to. Nothing has changed in their business, but they can't get credit. And
so is it a jobs issue?
Well, that's where jobs come from, and so that is why we don't have jobs, because the businesses can't get loans and therefore they can't hire. But the reason they can't get loans is that the local banks can't get the money from the Wall Street banks.
On the Web of Debt blog of yours from July the 15th, 2011, you say the local banks could turn to the Fed's discount window for loans, but that too could signal the banks were in trouble. And for the weak banks, the Fed's discount window may be closed. Further, the discount rate is triple the Fed funds rate. This is a vicious circle, all dumped on the backs of the general consumer, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it seems like there's a sort of an attempt to gobble up the small banks. It's a prejudicial thing where the big Wall Street banks have all the perks and all the advantages, and they have all the excess reserves, and the little banks don't.
And all the debt, and all of the credit default swaps, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So is there a solution? We only have about 30 seconds left, but is there a solution out of this?
Well, I certainly think they should not pay interest on the excess reserves, for starters. Just let the Fed funds rate do what it will. Their concern is about hyperinflation, but it's not going to hyperinflate. The money supply is $3 trillion short, according to the Fed's own figures, because of the collapse of the shadow banking system, which...
The shadow banking system, we don't have enough time to get into that. So with that, that's going to end this first segment. We're going to be back shortly after the break with Ellen Brown, who is the author of Web of Debt. You're going to want to stay tuned, and we'll see you next time right here on Public Exposure. Take care.